What was supposed to be a short operation turned into an 18-day chase that stretched nearly 6,500 kilometers across the Atlantic. The oil tanker, which later identified itself as Russian, refused to cooperate with American authorities and fled across the open sea instead of stopping. Military and diplomatic involvement in the case increased, raising legal questions. The situation became so serious that it was no longer just about one ship, but about United States-Russia relations. This is a reconstruction of the events that took place during those 18 days on the open ocean. The ship that was noticed. The story doesn't start with the escape, but with the fact that the tanker Bella One had been on the radar of American authorities for quite some time. It wasn't a random ship or target. Bella One had previously been placed on the United States Sanctions list as part of the so-called Shadow Fleet. Networks of tankers that were involved in transporting oil from countries under sanctions, often using false flags, changed names and turning off location systems. According to available data, the ship had made several suspicious voyages. Previously, it loaded oil in Iran on Karg Island, disabled its IS system in the Strait of Hormuz, and vanished from shipping maps for weeks. Later, it reappeared as a so-called ballast ship, officially without cargo, and continued its voyage through Suez, Gibraltar, and the Atlantic towards the Caribbean. In late November, Bella One neared Venezuelan waters. At that time, the United States was already significantly tightening the enforcement of sanctions against the Venezuelan oil sector and began physically stopping and detaining tankers that tried to trade with Venezuela. The American authorities had a court order to seize the ship and were preparing for standard procedure in international waters. When the American Coast Guard tried to stop the tanker and board it, a routine continuation of the operation was expected. However, the crew did not respond to the calls in the way that would be expected in similar situations. Instead of cooperating, Bella One suddenly changed course. The ship turned north and began moving away from the Caribbean toward the open Atlantic. At this moment, the situation changed dramatically. What was supposed to be a planned interception turned into a pursuit. The American Coast Guard decided not to stop tracking the ship, but also not to intervene immediately. Bella One continued sailing north, while behind her, an operation began to form that would gradually expand far beyond the original monitoring of a single sanctioned ship. And at this stage, no one publicly knew yet that the pursuit would last 18 days, that the ship would change its identity, and that not only Russian diplomacy, but eventually the military would get involved in the case. At that time, it seemed like a technical problem that could be solved later. But the ship was already heading into an area where every further decision would have much broader consequences. A dash to the north. After the tanker Bella One changed course and began moving away from the Caribbean, it was clear that this was neither a random decision nor a technical problem. The ship did not head to the nearest port, did not reduce speed, and did not signal any malfunction. On the contrary, it continued at a steady pace northward, heading into the open Atlantic. At that moment, the American Coast Guard decided on a strategy that might seem unusual. The ship was monitored continuously, but no action was taken. Bella One was thus able to continue sailing, while the Americans collected data about its movement, course, and the crew's behavior. The technical operation gradually turned into long-term surveillance. With each passing day, uncertainty about where the ship was actually heading increased. There was no officially confirmed target. Analysts and surveillance services were working with several possibilities. Return to the Caribbean, sail to the Baltic Sea, or seek protection in Russian waters. Each option would lead to a very different outcome. Meanwhile, it was increasingly clear that Bella One was no ordinary ship in trouble. The tanker was moving in a way typical of vessels trying to minimize attention, without unnecessary course changes, without communication, and with careful handling of positioning systems. For American authorities, this signaled the crew knew what they were doing and were trying to buy time. Time became crucial. The longer the pursuit lasted, the more its character changed. Legally, it remained a sanctioned ship, but operationally, if the tanker entered a sensitive area, such as under another state's protection, the situation could become much more complicated. Meanwhile, Americans had to consider when and where to intervene. An intervention in the Caribbean would differ from one in the North Atlantic. An intervention near European waters would have different diplomatic consequences than one farther from the mainland. Every extra day at sea pushed the tanker into regions where choices had greater political impact. For the Bella's crew, that meant only one thing: to continue sailing and hope they could reach a point where the Americans would hesitate to intervene. For the United States, on the other hand, it meant holding out, not ending the surveillance, and preparing for a situation where it would no longer be just about enforcing sanctions, but also about testing the limits of power on the open sea. At this stage, the pursuit was still taking place out of the public eye. There were no headlines or political statements. It was a quiet decision-making process that took place with every additional nautical mile. And it was at this moment, when it seemed like just a long and patient chase, that a move came which took the whole case to a completely different level. Change of identity. The key turning point came at the very beginning of the year. When the tanker Bella I was already deep in the Atlantic, the United States Coast Guard noticed a significant change. A Russian flag appeared on the hull of the ship. Shortly after, the tanker began identifying itself under the new name Marinera and appeared in the Russian ship registry. From a technical standpoint, this was nothing unusual. Ships involved in the so-called shadow fleet often change names and flags, repaint markings, and alter identification data. In this case, however, the change did not occur in port or as part of a standard administrative process, but directly during the voyage, in the midst of an ongoing pursuit. Shortly after the Russian flag was discovered, another step followed. Moscow sent an official diplomatic note to Washington, requesting that the United States stop the pursuit of the ship. From the Russian point of view, it was a vessel registered under the Russian flag, which is protected by the state and international law. At this point, the case shifted from a technical and legal level to a diplomatic one. The United States now faced not only a sanctioned ship issue, but also how to handle a formal request from another major power. If American forces had stopped the intervention, they would have sent a signal that changing the flag during a voyage might be enough to avoid detention. If they continued, they would risk accusations of violating the rights of a ship registered under a foreign flag. American authorities decided not to recognize the Russian reflagging. They argued that changing identity during a voyage, especially during an ongoing operation, has no legal weight. Therefore, they considered the tanker as a so-called stateless vessel, meaning a ship without valid national affiliation. This legal interpretation allowed the United States to continue operations in international waters. This meant a fundamental change for the pursuit. While up until then it was about monitoring a sanctioned ship, from this moment on, the case became a precedent. The question is now whether the United States will enforce their interpretation of the law, even with Russia formally involved, not just if they'll seize the tanker. At the same time, the first signs appeared that Moscow was monitoring the situation not only diplomatically. Russian military units began to appear in the area where the ship was operating. It was not direct interference, but a presence that could not be ignored. This moved the tension to a new level. From this moment on, it was no longer just about where the ship was heading. It was about where and under what conditions the United States would decide to intervene, and how the other side would react. Waiting as a strategy. After the tanker changed its identity and Russian diplomacy intervened, it may have appeared the United States would have to act right away. No intervention has occurred yet. The United States Coast Guard kept monitoring the ship, but did not try to board it. From the outside, this may have seemed like hesitation. In reality, it was a deliberate decision. At this point, it was clear that any further action would have political consequences. Detaining the tanker shortly after the Russian diplomatic note would mean risking a sharp reaction from Moscow. On the other hand, backing down would create a precedent that could be immediately used by dozens of other sanctioned ships. Waiting thus gained its own logic. The American authorities used the time to prepare. They monitored the tanker's route, assessed its technical condition, analyzed possible targets, and at the same time prepared various intervention scenarios. Another approach would have needed action near the Caribbean, another one in the mid-Atlantic, and a completely different one in the northern waters near Europe. Each option had different operational and diplomatic risks. At the same time, the perception of the case within the American administration was also changing. An operation against one ship was quickly turning into a test of a larger strategy. The issue was no longer if Bella broke the sanctions, but if the United States was willing to enforce its view of the sanctions worldwide, even far from home. This period was equally sensitive for Russia. On one hand, Moscow formally declared that it was a ship registered under the Russian flag. On the other hand, it was clear that an open confrontation over a single old tanker would come at an unreasonably high cost. That is also why the Russian response so far remained limited to diplomatic measures and a demonstrative presence in the area. Meanwhile, the tanker kept heading north. With each passing day, it was getting closer to the area where any intervention would have a much greater impact, not only militarily but also symbolically. The North Atlantic, nearby European countries, United States allies, and concerns over shipping security gave the operation a new dimension. So the waiting was not a sign of weakness, but a way to shift the initiative. The United States tried to choose a moment when the intervention would appear as a forced and justifiable step, not as a provocation. And it was at this point that the first signs began to appear that something more was being prepared than just further remote surveillance. Movement of forces. At the moment when the tanker was heading into the North Atlantic, the way the United States approached the operation also began to change. Tracking the ship was no longer just the task of the Coast Guard. Other branches of the American military and security apparatus gradually became involved in the case as well. According to available information, the United States began moving air and support capacities to Europe, primarily to bases in the United Kingdom. Transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft, and units designated for special operations appeared. This was not a last-minute improvisation, but a systematic preparation for several possible scenarios. At the same time, American reconnaissance planes began to appear above the tanker, monitoring its movement from above. Their task was not only to track the route, but also to collect data on the technical condition of the ship, the crew's behavior, and the surrounding maritime situation. Every detail could determine the location and nature of a possible intervention. The movement of forces also had added significance. These were signals that the United States was taking the situation seriously and preparing for the possibility that detaining the tanker would not be easy. However, it was a cautious signal, not a show of force. No harsh statements or ultimatums were made. Everything took place in a manner that was meant to minimize the risk of escalation. At the same time, it was clear that the other side was also watching what was happening. Russian military units appeared in the area where the tanker was moving. American sources reported a submarine, a surface ship, and later Russian military aircraft flyovers. It was not an attempt to intervene, but rather a demonstration of interest and the ability to monitor the situation. This was one of the story's most sensitive moments. In a relatively small area, both American and Russian military forces were operating, with both sides aware of each other's presence. Every maneuver, every flyover, every change of course could be interpreted in different ways. It was here that the thin line between a controlled operation and an unintended escalation became most apparent. Nevertheless, nothing dramatic happened. Russian units did not intervene, and American forces continued their preparations without direct contact. Both sides were clearly trying to keep the situation under control and avoid actions that could be seen as a provocation. While military planning was taking place in the background, the tanker was approaching the point where a decision could no longer be postponed. The closer it got to northern waters, the fewer options remained. At this point, the United States decided the waiting period was over. Intervention near Iceland. The decision was made when the tanker was in the North Atlantic, about 306 kilometers south of Iceland. This area was beyond the territorial waters of any state, yet logistically manageable and politically justifiable for the operation. The United States was making it clear that they did not see the intervention as a regional incident, but as the enforcement of sanctions in a global context. The detention occurred early in the morning. American helicopters approached the tanker, and Special Forces troops rappelled onto the deck. The operation occurred without gunfire or crew resistance. The tanker was taken under the control of the United States, and the pursuit, which lasted 18 days, thus came to an end. During the intervention, Russian military assets were also in the area. The American side stated that the Russian submarine and ship left soon after the operation began, with no direct confrontation. What seemed like a potential risk of escalation in the previous days ultimately ended without incident. From a technical standpoint, the intervention was successful. The ship was secured, the crew brought under control, and the tanker was then moved southward into the Atlantic. Politically, the story didn't end with the intervention. In fact, it was just the opposite. The question arose as to what the United States was aiming for with this move and what signal they were sending, not only to Russia, but also to all other actors operating sanctioned ships. Soon after the seizure, more details surfaced. Available information showed the tanker was not carrying oil during the intervention and was registered as a ship in so-called ballast condition, meaning without cargo. This fact is key to understanding the whole case. Why wasn't it about oil? In this case, the United States was not dealing with the cargo, but with a precedent. The message was meant to show that the sanctions don't just apply to the moment of transporting oil, but to the very operation of the entire shadow fleet. The answer lies in the fact that this case was never primarily about oil. With this intervention, the United States addressed a precedent. If the ship had been left without intervention just because it was without cargo at that moment, it would have created an opportunity to circumvent the sanctions. It would be enough to set sail empty, avoid inspection, and load the cargo later, or move between different routes without any real risk of being detained. At the same time, it was a clear signal to the so-called shadow fleet. These ships operate on the principle of low visibility, legal loopholes, and the assumption that intervention will only follow if the ship is caught directly with the cargo. The case of Bella 1 showed that this assumption may not hold. The ship's own history, its behavior, and the way it circumvents sanctions can be grounds for intervention. Detaining an empty tanker sent a message that reached far beyond this case. The United States was making it clear that they are prepared to monitor and intervene against sanctioned vessels, regardless of whether they are currently carrying cargo or not. And that what matters is not only what is on board, but also the role the ship plays in the broader network of illegal transport. For many players in the global oil trade, this meant a change in calculation. The risk was now not just during oil transport, but in the movement of sanctioned ships worldwide. That is why this case was closely watched not only in the United States and Russia, but also in countries that are the final recipients of sanctioned oil. In this context, the intervention near Iceland appears less like a one-time operation and more like part of a broader strategy. A strategy that aims to restrict the operation of the shadow fleet as a whole, not just stop one specific tanker on a particular day. The Bella 1 case wasn't just about one tanker or one cargo. It was about how far countries are willing to go today in enforcing sanctions, and where the boundaries are that they are no longer willing to cross. 18 days at sea showed that even without gunfire, a situation can arise where great powers come dangerously close to each other and at the same time consciously decide to stop.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. You can support my work through a thank you, and if you want to help the video reach more people, click on praise. I appreciate it.